I've been researching various aspects of the Kennedy assassination for over 13 years, and I've been teaching various Kennedy courses at the University of Pittsburgh for the past 3 years. And the more I read, the more I've come to realize that there's an overwhelming amount of data out there on all aspects of the assassination. It would take a person several years to read and research everything they could just on certain topics, much less research every aspect of the assassination. But one thing that sticks with me is the amount of time the research community has spent chasing phantoms. Some conspiracy theories are very valid and others are not. It's been 40 years since President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, and some researchers feel we are very close to discovering definitive answers in the case, and others don't feel that way. But whatever you believe, it is very important for us as researchers to not only clear up things that did happen, but we also have an obligation to clear up things that did not happen. And that's the purpose of my presentation this afternoon. As I'm sure you're all aware, there have been several planes that have been called Air Force One. However, my research focuses only on SAM 26000 because this was JFK's aircraft and it plays a role in a potential conspiracy. There are several books out there now that review all of the presidential aircraft, and if you're interested in those planes, you can check out barnesandnoble.com or amazon.com and you'll be able to locate them easily enough. One thing I would like to note is throughout my presentation I sometimes interchange the terms Air Force One and SAM 26000, and this is because the aircraft itself is referred to as SAM 26000, which is the physical tail number that's on the aircraft, as you can see in the slide here. However, when the President is aboard, it is called Air Force One. But whatever term I do use, unless specified otherwise, I am talking about JFK's airplane. On October 10, 1962, SAM 26000 was delivered to the U.S. Air Force by Boeing Aircraft. It was the first jet aircraft that was designed specifically for presidential use, and John F. Kennedy was the first president to make extensive use of a jet for presidential travel. The jet cost about $8.6 million. JFK and Jackie took their first flight aboard Air Force One on November 10, 1962. It was a 48-minute flight from Washington National Airport to Stewart Air Force Base in New York, and the purpose of the flight was to attend the funeral of former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. As we'll see, SAM 26000 was a very unique, customized aircraft. This cutaway diagram appeared in Life magazine and shows how different the plane was from normal jet aircraft. The plane has a presidential stateroom, which you can see here, right in this area, that was located behind the wings. And on previous aircraft that were used to transport the presidents that were propeller driven, the presidential cabin had always been placed behind the wings because it was quieter and it was a smoother ride. However, with this new jet airplane and its 4 very powerful and loud engines, this wasn't the case. JFK really liked the plane, however, and he didn't want to send it back to have it modified. You can also see by this diagram how the plane was laid out to accommodate staff, guests, and the Secret Service. At the rear of the aircraft, at the bottom here, is something called a ventral fin. It's right outside on the underside of the aircraft. This was put onto all Boeing 707 aircraft of this time period to provide extra stability while the plane was in flight. But more about the ventral fin later. This slide essentially shows 2 views of the same space. The picture on the right shows an interior shot of the presidential stateroom facing the forward part of the plane, where the president would work while the plane was in flight. This picture was taken before Lyndon Johnson redid the interior cabin. On November 22, 1963, when he was sworn in as president, Lyndon Johnson was standing, as you can see in the left photograph, to the left of center in the picture. When he became president, JFK had ordered the removal of the distinctive military lettering on the presidential plane, such as U.S. Air Force, or MATS, which stood for Military Air Transport Service, in favor of the simple designation United States of America. He wanted to shift the plane from a military character to one that suggested the national character of the aircraft. Enter Raymond Loewy, a famous industrial designer. Loewy came to the White House after convincing some Kennedy aides that the existing paint scheme, which you can see in the lower left corner, was fairly ugly. Jackie Kennedy agreed with this and became a very strong advocate for a new livery, which was very stylish for Air Force One. And Loewy met with JFK in May of '62 in the Oval Office, and he spent time on the floor with crayons and colored paper sketching out his ideas for how a new paint scheme for the plane should look. JFK had a preference for the use of the color blue, and Lowy took advantage of this. He designed a very elegant livery using different hues of blue, white, and silver, even going so far as to lighten the color of blue in the American flag on the tail to better match the paint elsewhere. He also put the presidential seal on the front of the plane, and he put the American flag on, and he put United States of America right down the fuselage on both sides. And Lowy's design was so popular that all subsequent U.S. or aircraft used as Air Force One have used this same distinctive paint scheme, including the two current Boeing 747s that are in service. Now, I became interested in this topic when I read David Lifton's book, Best Evidence, several years ago. And to briefly summarize Lifton's theory, he looked at the description of the wounds of JFK at Parkland Hospital, and then he looked at the description of the wounds that the pathologist had described at Bethesda. He felt that they described two different and distinct sets of wounds, and that Kennedy's wounds were altered between Parkland Hospital and Bethesda to prove that all three shots had been fired from above, behind, and to the rear, thus implicating Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone assassin. In essence, Lifton had an A on one hand, the wounds at Parkland, and a C on the other hand, the wounds at Bethesda. But he needed a B to connect them. There were only three possibilities. Number one, the ride from Parkland to Love Field. Number two, the plane ride back to Washington on Air Force One. And number three, the ride from Andrews Air Force Base to Bethesda Naval Hospital. The car rides were too well documented time-wise, and there were too many witnesses. The cars never stopped en route. That left the return trip on Air Force One. Lifton postulated that somehow during the swearing-in ceremony aboard the plane, JFK's body was secretly removed from the coffin and was somehow removed to the plane's baggage hold underneath the plane. When the plane arrived at Andrews Air Force Base, the body was secretly offloaded while the attention of the world was focused on the coffin being offloaded from the rear door and Jackie Kennedy getting off the plane. Lifton then postulates that the body was taken to Walter Reed Army Hospital by helicopter, where the wounds were altered to make it look like all the shots had hit JFK from behind. Then the body was put into a shipping casket and taken either by a black hearse or by helicopter to Bethesda. In the meantime, a military casket team was driving around Bethesda looking for the ambulance that supposedly had just transported Kennedy's body from the plane to Bethesda for the autopsy. In Lifton's plot, this is where the original casket met back up with the body. Now, Lifton is sketchy on the details, but he claims that only four people's moves are relevant on Air Force One: Jackie Kennedy, General Godfrey McHugh, Kenny O'Donnell, and Larry O'Brien, as one of them was supposedly with the coffin at all times when it was aboard the plane. However, this is only true if there was a way to remove the body from the coffin and the rear compartment of the plane without being seen in the first place, and if there was a space aboard the aircraft on the return flight to hide a body. This photo is taken from a very unique angle, the rear door of Air Force Two. This photo shows JFK's coffin being loaded aboard Air Force One, but it is also unique for what it does not show. The rear baggage hold is not open, and if it's located right here in the picture's kind of dark, but it's located right here behind the wing to accommodate a body being put aboard the aircraft at that location. Any photograph I've ever seen of the coffin being loaded aboard has been one of the series taken by White House photographer Cecil Stoughton as he stood in the left front door facing over the left wing back towards the back of the aircraft. Now, Craig Roberts picked up the story from here in his book Kill Zone. He thought that SAM 26000 had been substituted for a Boeing 720, which is a smaller version of the 707. He felt there were less windows on SAM 26000 in Dallas, which pointed toward it being a different and smaller aircraft. He felt the absence of a rear ventral fin on the plane in later pictures of SAM 26000 proved that the plane in Dallas had not been the same aircraft. Now, why switch the planes in the first place? Roberts thought that plane was switched to allow the rear cargo hold to have been converted to conduct body alteration on the return trip. Now, if this is true, this means that first, the conspirators knew ahead of time that Zapruder would be filming. Second, that the assassination would look like JFK had been shot from the front. And third, that it would be necessary to alter the wounds. All questions and assumptions that I find to be absurd. However, after doing more research, Roberts realized that the crew would have known if they weren't really flying their own aircraft because of all the extra things in the design of the aircraft. And he came to the conclusion that the plane really was SAM 26000. And I also thought, wouldn't people realize that there were now less seats on the aircraft? Roberts mentioned that further research explained that the ventral fin had been removed in March of 1969 when the plane had gone to Boeing for several different upgrades. I later confirmed that some type of baffles had been added to the inside of the vertical tail to help stabilize the aircraft, and the lower ventral fin was no longer needed and was removed. Once Roberts realized the plane really was SAM 26000, he went on to state that there was a trap door in the center aisle of SAM 26000 that would have been right beside where the coffin was sitting, and that this would have allowed a conspirator to pop up during Lyndon Johnson's swearing-in ceremony, remove Kennedy's body from the coffin, and hide it in the lower rear baggage hold where body alteration could be performed during the return flight to Washington, D.C. Roberts used to work on a military 707. He claims that a maintenance manual says there's an aft cargo compartment ceiling access panel, and he assumed that this meant a trapdoor between the rear cargo compartment and the rear passenger compartment. But I later came to realize that this was not true. One other thing that deserves to be cleared up that's kind of been hanging out there for 40 years. There was a discussion about whether Lyndon Johnson should have returned aboard Air Force One or Air Force Two. And when this happened, several of his aides remarked that when they returned to Love Field from Parkland Hospital, they boarded the first aircraft they came to. They claimed that the aircraft were virtually indistinguishable except by looking at the tail numbers of the aircraft. This period photograph, which was taken the morning of November 22nd at Love Field, shows that this was not true. The tails are painted different colors on the two aircraft. For lack of a better word, the swoosh on Air Force One is painted blue to match the rest of the plane, while the swoosh on Air Force Two is painted a bright day-glow orange, which aided other planes being able to see it when it was airborne. And you can see it's blue here on Air Force One and orange here on Air Force Two. So I think it's time to put this myth to rest. Lyndon Johnson had many reasons to return to Washington, D.C. aboard Air Force One, but claims of the planes being impossible to tell apart have no place in these reasons. Now, data is scarce. You can't just call up Andrews Air Force Base and tell them you want to come and visit the presidential aircraft, nor can you call their public relations office and ask them to send you a current set of blueprints of the interior, complete with the locations of any trapdoors. I had a tough time getting Boeing to shake loose what they were willing to eventually share with me, and this was for an aircraft that had been retired since 1998. So David Lifton and others had to rely on whatever data they could shake loose about the interior of the aircraft. William Manchester included a sketch of the interior of Air Force One in his book, Death of a President. This is the top diagram here in the picture. It's not clear where he obtained his diagram, maybe from somebody who had flown on the aircraft, or perhaps he had flown on the plane himself. Lifton also included a rough sketch of the interior of Air Force One in his book, Best Evidence. However, Lifton's drawing incorrectly leads you to believe that there was plenty of room in the back of the plane. I've been on the plane numerous times and have measured it, and there is not much room. Also note that in Lifton's drawing, which is on the bottom, Air Force One looks somewhat like a fat sausage, which is also incorrect. In Manchester's drawing, the plane's scale is right, but the size of the coffin is too small. Now, these are just representative drawings, I understand this, but when people start to advance theories based on them and cannot corroborate the data elsewhere, that's how inaccuracies get started and theories start to snowball. This photograph shows the position of interior hallway doors that separated the rear compartment from the presidential stateroom, where the swearing-in took place. David Lifton never mentioned them in his theory or included them in his interior diagram of the aircraft. And the question I wondered was, did he even know that they existed? If they'd been closed during the swearing-in ceremony, they might have strengthened his argument and provided additional secrecy if JFK's body had been removed from the coffin for body alteration to have occurred. Now, Lifton claims in his book that he spoke with Air Force One pilot Jim Swindow and relied on information from Boeing when looking at the interior of the airplane. Apparently, neither ever told him about the existence of these two doors that effectively closed off the presidential cabin from the rear compartment. Now, on balance, William Manchester's diagram did not show these two doors either. In May of 1998, SAM 26000 was retired to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base near Dayton, Ohio. At first, the aircraft was left outside for people to tour. Then it was closed down for several months while the restoration crews worked on it. The aircraft was eventually put on display in the presidential hangar. Now, the center aisle in the plane was narrowed down to 17 inches across by the installation of clear plexiglass walls, which prevent people from touching or destroying the leather seatings or taking souvenirs. They also removed all of the interior doors and put them into the rear cargo hold for storage. Now, my first trip to SAM 26000 was in September 1999 with Glenn Vassbinder, a fellow researcher and instructor of mine at Pitt. We found a weakness in the center aisle of the rear floor at the level of the second window on the port, which is the left side of the aircraft moving forward from the rear entry door. It measured approximately 17 inches by 19 inches. The weakness was symmetrical and was buried underneath the carpeted aisle. Unless you were standing on it, you wouldn't even know it's there. At the time, we figured we were onto something, and Craig Roberts' theory might have some merit. I photographed the underside of the plane where the ventral fin had originally been attached to the plane, as well as the locations of the hold doors. There are 3 of them, all on the starboard or right side of the aircraft, 1 in front of the wing and 2 behind the wing. We photographed basically every inch of the aircraft, and we were very fortunate because there weren't a lot of people that day, and we were able to spend several hours photographing the aircraft. When we returned to Pittsburgh, we began to conduct more research on the potential existence of Craig Roberts' trapdoor. Now, this is the actual bulkhead that was cut and removed in Dallas on November 22, 1963. It is still on the plane today. The idea of placing Kennedy's coffin in the cargo hold of Air Force One was rejected out of hand by the crew. It just wasn't ceremonious. So the Air Force One crew had to work fast to make the plane ready to transport the coffin. 2 rows of seats, 4 in all, were removed, along with this bulkhead just inside the rear port side presidential door. The seats were sent over to Air Force Two to be sent back to Washington. Air Force Two was already loaded with the luggage from the remainder of the presidential and vice presidential parties that had been accompanying the 2 leaders on the trip to Texas. Now, despite the preparations, it took no small effort to load the 900-pound bronze casket up the narrow steps and into the rear compartment. There was some considerable movement to get the casket put into place. Once it was aboard, the rear steps were removed, and the rear door was closed at once. I've spoken with a woman who was at Love Field and who witnessed the casket loading. She said the rear door was never reopened once the casket was loaded aboard. She stayed at Love Field until Air Force One took off and made a very fast and steep climb into the sky. Following Johnson's swearing in as president, whoever was not going to Washington got off the plane by way of the front port side door. The door was shut, and the plane started to taxi. In order to try to prove or disprove Lifton's claims of body alteration on the aircraft, Glenn and I started to read through the different testimony of individuals who had actually carried the coffin onto the plane. Several people mentioned the struggle to get the coffin into such a tight space. One mentioned how he had to back into a closet in order to make the turn. Now keep that in mind. We initially thought we were onto something when we looked at exactly how the coffin was loaded onto the plane in Dallas, thinking it could be important to whether the hinges on the coffin lid were against the port side wall or were against the aisle. If against the wall, it might have been possible to open the coffin lid. If against the aisle, it would be difficult to open the coffin lid. I went to several books, most notably Trask's Pictures of the Pain and That Day in Dallas, to locate the best quality White House pictures Stoughton had taken of the coffin loading in Dallas. I then sent copies to a friend who's a funeral director. He confirmed that what I thought were hinges actually were hinges, and you can see them here circled in red. Going up the steps, they are facing the camera. And he also confirmed the position of how JFK's body would have been positioned in the casket based on standard funeral practices. His head was on the right-hand side, and his feet would have been here on the left-hand side. But we kept coming back to the comment made by one or more of the people who helped load the coffin aboard, that they'd backed into a closet in order to make the tight turn and get the coffin into place along the port side wall. At this point, all we had to work with was Manchester's diagram blown up here, showing how we first thought the coffin had gone into the plane. We thought we had it all figured out. The hinges were facing the aisle based on the closet comment, going straight in and then turned and dropped right there. We started concentrating on if there indeed was a trapdoor buried under the carpet where we'd felt a weakness in the floor, how would anyone have been able to come up out of a 17-inch by 19-inch trapdoor, open the coffin lid, and lift Kennedy's body over top of the coffin lid, then somehow manhandle the body down through the trapdoor without getting any blood onto the carpet, and doing all of this very quickly and quietly when there were approximately 27 people standing 10 feet away in the main presidential cabin attending the swearing in. Any one of them could have stepped back into the rear cabin at any time, or at the very least looked through one of the doors. At the time, we never even stopped to think about the interior curvature of the airplane and how the plane, if pressed against the side of the plane for the coffin, if it was pressed against the inside of the plane for stability while in flight, would have made it virtually impossible to open the coffin lid, much less lift a body over the top of the lid. I realized at this point that neither Manchester's nor Lifton's interior diagrams were accurate enough to clean up things, so at this point I wrote to Boeing and requested an official interior diagram of the plane as it existed in 1962. By now it was almost a year later. In August of 2000, the Boeing diagram finally arrived, and I've reproduced a part of it here. In this diagram, the overhead floor plan, which is on the top, lines up perfectly with the cutaway diagram, which is very helpful in many instances. We realized right away that Manchester's drawing and the picture published in Life magazine, which I showed earlier, had incorrectly placed a closet behind the rear galley. Instead, what people had called a closet was really a storage and service area in front of the rear galley. It's located right here. And it had curtains across it, which hid the rear starboard galley loading door. This was later confirmed by an interview I conducted with a retired flight engineer on the aircraft who told me that the crew referred to this area in front of the rear galley as a closet because miscellaneous food-related items were kept here during the flight. But more about the flight engineer later. Once we had Boeing's diagram to work with, we realized we'd been wrong about our assumption about how the coffin had been loaded. Instead, the hinges were placed against the fuselage, meaning the coffin would open into the aisle. This discovery cleared up the coffin's position, but it still left Craig Roberts' theory of an unseen trap door unresolved. We realized at this time that in order to put this theory to rest, one way or the other, we needed to get into the cargo holds underneath the airplane and see once and for all what was below that weakness in the rear compartment's floor. Glenn and I made a second trip in September of 2000 to see SAM 26000, and this time we took along lots of paper, film, and a digital camera. This was done primarily because I was creating an exhibit book on the aircraft that was going to be presented at the upcoming JFK Lancer November in Dallas conference 2 months later. When we went to the conference, I intentionally did not include the interior diagram I'd received from Boeing because I still had more research to conduct. While at the conference, I spoke with Craig Roberts. We spoke about the number of windows on the plane, which he said backed up his theory that 26000 was not the same plane in Dallas on November 22nd. He claimed that there were only 53 windows on the port side of the plane in Dallas, but 58 windows at other times. He felt this supported his theory that Air Force One had been substituted for a shorter Boeing 720. However, he didn't have any answers to my question of how the conspirators were able to remove rows of seats assigned to real people now who were flying on the trip without anyone noticing. In early 2001, I made contact with a retired flight engineer who had flown on all of the Boeing 707s that made up the presidential fleet, primarily on SAM 26000 and SAM 27000, which was the plane brought into service when Richard Nixon was president. Some of the comments I'll add about what you'll see on the next slides were relayed to me by him during our many phone conversations, emails, and exchanges of documents. To be fair, I never told him about any of the conspiracy theories surrounding body alteration aboard Air Force One until many months later, after asking him specific questions about the technical aspects of the plane. After returning from the conference in Dallas, I developed a personal contact at Wright-Patterson. With his assistance, I made special arrangements for Glenn and me to tour SAM 26000 early in the morning before the presidential aircraft hangar was open to the public. After further correspondence with the commanding general of the U.S. Air Force Museum, I secured special permission for us to have the baggage holds underneath the aircraft open for inspection. Wright-Patterson also offered to have their presidential aircraft historian, Dr. Jeffrey Underwood, on hand to answer questions about the aircraft. In June of 2001, Glenn and I drove to Wright-Patterson early on a Sunday morning, even though our appointment wasn't until 7 in the morning the next day. We were loaded down with lots of photographic equipment, ladders, cables, lights, etc., because we knew we'd only get one shot at this. Now armed with cleaned up copies of Boeing's interior diagram, which included locations of all of the windows, we spent over 4 hours repeatedly going through the plane and photographing everything we could. We counted windows, measured distances between the cargo hatches, measured the back doors opening, etc. We took both digital still photos and video footage of all different areas of the aircraft because we wanted to be able to concentrate the following morning on the baggage holds and speaking with Dr. Underwood. Now, we counted the windows. They matched up perfectly with Boeing's diagram. It's important to remember that even if windows don't have glass in them, you can still see their outlines because they're covered in aluminum and you can see the little rivets that hold them into place. Therefore, they can still be counted. Now, certain windows are covered over with aluminum, even on today's Boeing 747 Air Force One, because there are walls that separate the cabin inside at the location of the windows that are covered. I later got a hold of many different photos of SAM 26000, and in every instance, The number of windows, either with or without glass, was always consistent at 58 windows, including ones that I could locate on November 22nd, 1963 of the Dallas trip. This diminished Robert's theory of the plane being switched. On Monday morning, we met with the PR representative, Nicole Van Natter. The restoration crew was on hand with bolt cutters, and they cut off the padlocks holding the cargo holds closed and opened both the front and rear cargo doors for us. The only stipulation they had placed on us was that we were not physically permitted to climb into the aircraft, into the cargo holds, but we were permitted to climb a ladder and lean in as far as possible, and we were permitted to take photos and video footage. We wore cloth gloves as well, so we could hold on to the outer aluminum skin of the aircraft to really be able to lean in and get better shots, because normally you're not permitted to touch the skin of the aircraft with your bare hands, because they tell you that the oils in the skin break down the aluminum aircraft frame over time. Now, the pictures on the following slides were taken on that trip. This is the front hold with the built-in ladder. It has a ladder that's actually built right into the aircraft's frame, which you can see, well, I guess you can't, it's a little dark. Right here, it's bolted in. And it folds up in the middle there that you can see. The flight engineer I spoke with also told me that most of the time they carried a ladder with extendable ends, because that helped them facilitate fueling up under the wings, checking the oil, and other things like putting engine covers on. This photograph shows the white cabinets where there used to be the top secret electronic communications gear, right in here, and that has all been since removed from the aircraft. This photo is facing the front of the aircraft and shows a trap door, right here, vertically oriented, that leads to the avionics compartment, which is called Lower 41 by Boeing, after passing over the front wheel well. There is a trap door that leads, after you get through that trap door, up into the cockpit directly beneath the navigator's seat, which is located directly behind the pilot's seat on the port side of the aircraft. This blackened area right here is above that air conditioner. It's yellow there. That was just put in by Wright-Patterson to help cool the aircraft, because it heats up very quickly because there's always people in there. And it originally, before that unit was put in, that area leads up to a ladder that goes to a second trap door that opens in the floor directly behind the communications shack, right in front of the 4 first-class seats, which were usually occupied by either senior staff members or else the Secret Service. Now, this unit back here is the auxiliary power unit, which is used to start the aircraft engines when the plane is preparing to depart and they don't want to have to start using the ground truck. Also, the APU provided power to the aircraft when it would be sitting at the airport waiting for the president to return from whatever trip he was on, kept the systems up, kept heat on in cold weather. Now, the flight engineer told me that in flight, and this is a quote, "In flight, it was absolutely packed down there with suitcases, cases of water, maintenance equipment, coolers, etc." Now, this is the rear cargo hold. The door is open here, located right behind the wing. You can see our ladders laying inside of it. It shows we needed a standard 6-foot step ladder to access the main door of the rear cargo hold, which is located just behind the starboard wing on the right side of the plane. As with the forward cargo hold, the rear cargo hold door slides inside and to the right. This photograph is looking to the right of the rear hold, or facing the front of the aircraft. There is no access to the forward hold from the rear hold. They are sealed off from each other by the main landing gear bays and the center fuel tanks. On the other side of the wall you see here are the main landing gear bays. You can see the netting here on both sides of the picture that helped hold luggage in place while the plane was in flight so it wouldn't shift around. This is a shot looking slightly to the right of the main door. This is where they stored the doors that have been removed from the upstairs compartments, which I mentioned earlier. They're laying right here. There's a table-like structure that's built into the rear hold on the port or left side. Our first thought when seeing this was, wow, hey, a body and a body bag could have been laid on this table. However, luggage is usually stacked here, and there was a large amount of luggage on this trip to Texas due to the multiple stops. There was a large complement of food stored in both cargo holds for the Texas trip. You cannot stand up in either of the cargo holds, which makes it difficult to move things or perform any kinds of work there. There is extremely poor lighting in the cargo holds. A single person riding here would have needed multiple bottles of oxygen to survive the return trip to Washington, D.C. Even more bottles would have been needed if there were more people. And again, space is extremely limited in this cargo hold. It would have been very cold in this space also. Even though the hold was pressurized, it was not heated. And most importantly, right above the door here, right about this location, straight up, there is a viewing lens mounted in the ceiling. Anyone standing up in the main cabin would have been able to look right down into the rear cargo hold and would have been able to see anything that was going on. This is what I like to call the money shot. This picture looks to the left of the rear cargo hold toward the back of the plane. Now it's a little difficult to see. This area here is actually just a hatch that is screwed in by about 10 screws on all sides. It is not open, it doesn't swing in, it doesn't go anywhere. This looks toward the back of the aircraft. The moment we both looked in this direction, we realized that there is no trap door leading up into the rear passenger compartment. The approximately 18 by 18 inch ceiling vent that you see here does not open and is located directly beneath what would have been the presidential cabin's bathroom in 1963, at least 10 feet forward of where the coffin was placed. Approximately 10 screws on each side of this vent hold it into place, and I was able to see wires and pipes running through this area behind this little vent cover here from front to back. In addition, the location of a trap door and the 17-inch by 19-inch weakness would have been all the way at the back of the cargo ceiling, and there's nothing there. Most importantly, the weakness in the floor upstairs does not line up with this 18-inch hatch. You can also see there are built-in cargo nets on the side here that hold luggage in place while the plane is in flight. You can also see there's no trap door leading up to the rear passenger compartment. If there had been one, it would have been located in the ceiling all the way to the rear of this compartment. Now, how does it all line up? Using Boeing's diagram and transposing all of the measurements we took while at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, this is how things line up. I've added blue lines in to illustrate the location of the 17-inch by 19-inch weakness in the rear floor of the passenger compartment, which is the right-hand blue line, as well as the location of the ceiling vent in the rear cargo hold at the left-hand blue line. Notice again that these two locations do not correspond to each other and are separated by several feet. Now, I did ask the retired flight engineer about the weakness in the rear passenger compartment floor. He stated that he and the maintenance crew had often wondered what that weakness was, and they later learned that it was an access point for Boeing engineers to check and maintain control cables when the plane would go back to Boeing periodically for overhaul maintenance. Now, several months ago, I was finally able to get a hold of the U.S. Air Force's flight manual for SAM-2 6000. And I realize the detail of this aircraft, this picture is difficult to see. However, what is significant is that in the diagram on the bottom, it clearly illustrates the hatches that access the cargo compartments. There's one right here, which goes down into lower 41, and there's one right here behind the communication shack, and it says here, access door to lower cargo compartment. And there are only two, and they only access the forward compartment. There is no access to the rear cargo compartment. Now, shortly after this time, I wrote to Boeing again, and I requested more information specifically about SAM-2 6000, especially asking them point blank if there was any access to either of the cargo holds from the upper passenger compartments. Now, this time Boeing was a little more helpful because I told them I was teaching a course on JFK and his airplane at the University of Pittsburgh. This time they sent me a copy of the manual that Boeing specifically prepared for the U.S. Air Force when they took possession of the plane in October 1962. This manual clearly states that there is only access to the forward cargo compartments and there is no access to the rear cargo hold from the rear passenger compartment. In addition, I was also able to get a hold of a Boeing 707-320 series manual for the commercial version of this aircraft. At the time, I thought maybe Craig Roberts had stumbled across something on a commercial 707 and assumed it was also aboard Air Force One. However, this manual also confirmed what the Boeing manual already said on Air Force One: no access from the rear passenger compartment to the rear cargo hold. Now, this manual on the 707-320 was very instructive because it also showed a cutaway drawing of the airplane showing how control cables, pipes, and various electrical cables run through the floor under the middle aisle of the aircraft from front to back, directly through the 17-inch by 19-inch weakness we discovered on our first trip to tour SAM-2 6000. So where does this bring us? Clearly, the plane was not switched for a look-alike Boeing 720 in Dallas. There are and always have been a consistent number of windows, 58 of them, on the port side of the plane. There is no rear trap door into the rear cargo hold into which a body could have been moved. The weakness in the rear floor contains control cables used in the plane's normal operation and was not accessible during flight. In addition, from talking to the witness at Love Field, after loading the coffin aboard, the rear door was never reopened to remove the body from the rear compartment. And finally, the one photo I showed earlier, taken from the rear door of Air Force Two, shows that there were no doors open on the right side of the aircraft and the cargo hold doors were not open. Now, I believe it's important to discover what the facts are in the Kennedy assassination. This is easier said than done in many respects. But finding answers to what happened is only half of the battle. The other half is finding answers to what did not happen and putting those rumors to rest so we can focus on the truth. It is important that we as researchers continue to pursue the truth in order to clear up as much of the mystery surrounding the assassination of President John F. Kennedy as we possibly can. We owe it to our country, and more importantly, we owe it to ourselves and future generations. Thank you.